Several decades ago, my doctoral father, Richard Rorty, suggested that philosophical admirers of Wilfrid Sellars could be divided into two schools, depending on which of two famous passages from Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind they take to express his most important insight. And the two passages are the Scientia Mensura that we have been talking about, and which I will have some further things to say about later on, in the dimension of describing and explaining the world. Science is the measure of all things, of what is that it is, and of what is not that is not. That's from section 41. And in characterizing an episode as that of knowing, and I would say equally he means believing, we're not giving an empirical description of that episode or state. We're placing it in the logical space of reasons, of justifying and being able to justify what one says. That's from section 36. That the Scientia Mensura expresses a certain kind of scientific naturalism, and one of the questions we'll be talking about later in the day is exactly what is living and what is dead in that scientific naturalism. But its opening qualification is important. There are other important discursive and cognitive activities besides describing and explaining. And the second passage says that characterizing something as a knowing, as a believing, as having a propositional content is one of them. One is in describing something as conceptually contentful, in saying that something is conceptually contentful, one is not describing it, one is placing it into a normative space, articulated by relations of what's a reason for what. Meaning, for Sellars, is a normative phenomenon, and it doesn't fall within the descriptive realm over which natural science is authoritative. Rorty called those impressed by the scientific naturalism of the Scientia Mensura right-wing Sellarsians, and those impressed by the normative non-naturalism about semantics expressed in the other passage, left-wing Sellarsians. Acknowledging the antecedents of this use, he used to express the hope that the right-wing and left-wing Sellarsians would be able to discuss their disagreements more amicably and ironically than did the right-wing and left-wing Hegelians, who, as Rorty would put it, eventually sorted out their differences at a 6-month-long seminar called the Battle of Stalingrad. According to this botanization, I am, like my teacher Rorty and my colleague John McDowell, a left-wing Sellarsian, by contrast to such eminent and admirable right-wing Sellarsians as Ruth Millikan, Jay Rosenberg, and Paul Churchland. Now, I think Rorty's way of dividing things up is helpful. There really are 41ers and 36ers, but I want to explore a different perspective on some of these same issues. I, too, want to focus on two big ideas that orient Sellars' thought. And I also want to say that one of them is a good idea, and the other one, on the whole, a bad idea. And that's a structure that's in common with those who would identify as either right or left-wing Sellarsians. And the one I want to reject is near and dear to the heart of the right wing. But I want, first, to situate the ideas I'll consider in the context of Sellars' neo-Kantianism. Specifically, they're what Sellars makes of two fundamental ideas that are at the center of Kant's transcendental idealism: the meta-concept of categories, or pure concepts of the understanding, and the distinction between phenomena and noumena. The latter is a version of the distinction between appearance and reality, not in a light epistemological sense, but in an ontologically weighty sense that's given voice by the Scientia Mensura. I can't say that these fall under the headings, respectively, of what is living and what is dead in Sellars' thought, in particular since the sort of scientific naturalism he uses to interpret Kant's phenomena-noumena distinction is undoubtedly very widespread and influential in contemporary Anglophone philosophy. My aim here is to explain what I take it Sellars makes of the most promising of these Kantian ideas, the idea of the categories. When asked what he hoped the effect of his work might be, Sellars said he would be happy if it helped to usher analytic philosophy from its Humean into its Kantian phase. Apropos of this remark, Rorty wrote, also not without justice, that in these terms my own work could be seen as an effort to help clear the way from analytic philosophy's incipient Kantian phase to an eventual Hegelian one. Sellars tells us that his reading of Kant lies at the center of his work. He used that theme to structure his John Locke lectures, to the point of devoting the first lecture to presenting a version of the transcendental aesthetic with which Kant opens the Critique of Pure Reason. Those lectures, published as Science and Metaphysics, subtitled Variations on Kantian Themes, are Sellers' only book-length systematic exposition of his views during his crucial middle period. The development of Kantian themes is not only self-consciously used to give that book its distinctive shape, but also implicitly determines the contours of Sellers' work as a whole. I think the best way to think about Sellers' work is as a continuation of the Neo-Kantian tradition. In particular, I think he's the figure we should look to today in an appropriation of Kant's theoretical philosophy that might be as fruitful as the appropriation of Kant's practical philosophy that Rawls initiated. On the theoretical side, I take Sellers simply to be the greatest Neo-Kantian philosopher of his generation. In fact, the most prominent Neo-Kantians of the previous generation, C.I. Lewis and Rudolf Carnap, were among the most immediate influences on Sellers' thought. Kant was the door through which Lewis found philosophy, and later the common route to which he reverted in his attempt to reconcile what seemed right to him about the apparently antithetical views of his teachers, William James and Josiah Royce. Had he instead tried to synthesize Royce with Dewey instead of James, I think he would have fetched up at Hegel. In his 1929 Mind and the World Order, Lewis introduced as a central technical conception the notion of the sensory given, capitalized, which Sellers would famously use, characteristically without so much as mentioning Lewis by name, as the paradigm of what he and EPM called the myth of the given. Indeed, shortly after his 1946 An Analysis of Knowledge and Valuation, which Sellers also clearly has in mind in EPM, Lewis wrote a piece addressing the question, it's the title of his article, is the givenness of the given given? His answer was no. It's a postulate of high philosophical theory, which dictates that without a sensory given, empirical knowledge would be impossible. In my recent book on Sellers, I argue that Sellers modeled his own Kantian metalinguistic treatment of modality and the ontological status of universals explicitly on ideas of Carnap. Though, like Lewis, Carnap is not explicitly mentioned in EPM, his presence is registered for the philosophical cognoscenti Sellers took himself to be addressing there by the use of the Carnapian term protocol sentence, as well as Schlick's Konstatierung, for non-inferential observations. Unlike Lewis, Carnap actually stood in the line of inheritance of classical 19th century German Neo-Kantianism. His teacher, Bruno Bauch, was, like Heidegger, a student of Heinrich Rickert in Freiburg, who, with the older Wilhelm Windelband, led the Southwest or Baden Neo-Kantian school. In spite of these antecedents, Bauch was in many ways closer to the Marburg Neo-Kantians, Hermann Cohen and Paul Nathorp, in reading Kant as first and foremost a philosopher of the natural sciences, of mathematics, and of logic. I suppose that if one had asked Carnap in what way his own work could be seen as a continuation of the Neo-Kantian tradition of his teacher, he would first have identified with this Marburg Neo-Kantian understanding of Kant, and then pointed to the specifically logical element of his logical empiricism, itself a development of the path-breaking work of Frege, Bruno Bauch's friend and colleague at Jena, when Carnap studied there with both of them, as giving a precise and modern form to the conceptual element in empirical knowledge, which deserved to be seen as a worthy successor to Kant's own version of the conceptual. Now, if Lewis and Carnap don't immediately spring to mind as Neo-Kantians, that's because each of them gave Kant a distinctively empiricist twist, which Sellers was concerned, I want to claim, to undo. If you thought that Kant thought that the classical empiricist's Cartesian understanding of the sensory contribution to knowledge was pretty much all right, and just needed to be supplemented by an account of the independent contribution made by a conceptual element, you might well respond to the development of the new 20th century logic with a version of Kant that looks like Lewis's Mind and the World Order and Analysis of Knowledge and Valuation and Carnap's Aufbau, or for that matter, Nelson Goodman's Structure of Appearance. That assumption about Kant's understanding of the role played by sense experience in empirical knowledge is exactly what Sellers challenges in EPM. One of the consequences of his doing that is to make visible the Neo-Kantian strand in analytic philosophy that Lewis and Carnap each in his own way represented, and which Sellers, and in our own time John McDowell, further developed. Quine was, of course, a student both of Lewis and of Carnap, and the Kantian element of the common empiricism he found congenial in their thought, for him, drops out entirely, even though the logic remains. Quine's Lewis and Quine's Carnap are much more congenial to a narrative of the history of analytic philosophy initiated by Russell and Moore, according to which the movement is given its characteristic defining shape as a recoil from Hegel, seen through the lens of the British idealism of the waning years of the 19th century. They understood enough about the Kantian basis of Hegel's thought to know that a holus bolus rejection of Hegel required a diagnosis of the idealist rot as having set in already with Kant. This narrative does pick out one current in the analytic river, indeed the one that made necessary the reappropriation of the metaconceptual resources of Kant's theoretical philosophy in the late 20th and early 21st century. But it was never the whole story. The neo-Kantian tradition, comprising Lewis and Carnap and Sellers, can be thought of as an undercurrent, somewhat occluded from view by the empiricist surface. Now, many Kantian themes run through Sellers' philosophy. My book is oriented around two master ideas, each of which orients and ties together a number of otherwise apparently disparate aspects of his work. One is the strand of scientific naturalism, which I reject on behalf of Sellers' own better wisdom, or so I claim. The one I'm going to focus on in this talk is the good idea that besides concepts whose characteristic expressive job it is to describe and explain empirical goings-on, they're concepts whose distinctive characteristic expressive job it is to make explicit necessary structural features of the discursive framework within which alone description and explanation are possible. Failing to acknowledge and appreciate this crucial difference between the expressive roles different bits of vocabulary play is a perennial source of distinctively philosophical misunderstanding. In particular, Sellers thinks attempting to understand concepts doing the second, framework explicating sort of work on the model of those whose proper use is in empirical description and explanation is a fount of metaphysical and semantic confusion. Among the vocabularies that play this second sort of role, Sellers includes not only modal vocabulary, the elethic but also the deontic species, semantic vocabulary, intentional vocabulary, and ontological categorial vocabulary, terms such as proposition, property or universal, object in particular. It's a mistake, he thinks, to understand the use of any of these sorts of vocabulary as fact-stating in the narrow sense that assimilates it to describing how the world empirically is. And it's a corresponding mistake to recoil from the metaphysical peculiarity and extravagance of the kind of facts that one must postulate in order to understand statements couched in those vocabularies as fact-stating in the narrow sense, normative facts, semantic facts, conditional facts, facts about abstract universals, by denying that such statements are legitimate or even that they can be true. Though, of course, to say that they are true for Sellers is not to describe them. Both mistakes, the dogmatic metaphysical and the skeptical, though opposed to one another, stem from a common root, what Sellers called the descriptivist fallacy. That's the failure to see that some perfectly legitimate concepts don't play a narrowly descriptive role, but rather a different, explicative one, with respect to the practices of description and explanation. Following Carnap, Sellers instead analyzes the use of all these kinds of vocabulary as each in its own way, as he put it, covertly metalinguistic. In opposing a Procrustean descriptivism about the expressive roles locutions can play, Sellers makes common cause with the later Wittgenstein. For Wittgenstein, too, devotes a great deal of effort and attention to warning us of the dangers of being enthralled to, he says, bewitched by, a descriptivist picture. We must not simply assume that the job of all declarative sentences is to state facts. Think about, I am in pain, or it is a fact that. Or that the job of all singular terms is to pick out objects. For Wittgenstein, statements like, I think, or I have a pain in my foot, and so on. In addition to tools for attaching, detaching, and in general reshaping material objects, hammers and nails, saws and draw knives, the carpenter's tools, he reminds us, also include plans, a foot rule, a level, a pencil, and a tool belt. So too with discursive expressive tools. Wittgenstein's expressive pluralism, language construed as a motley, certainly involves endorsement of the anti-descriptivism that Sellers epitomizes by saying, in a passage we've heard more than once the tautology, the world is described by descriptive concepts, is freed from the idea that the business of all non-logical concepts is to describe, the way is clear to an ungrudging recognition that many expressions which empiricists have relegated to second-class citizenship in discourse are not inferior, they're just different. But Sellers differs substantially from Wittgenstein in characterizing at least a broad class of non-descriptive vocabularies as playing generically the same expressive role. They're broadly metalinguistic locutions, expressing necessary features of the framework of discursive practices that make empirical description and explanation possible. Of this broad binary distinction of expressive roles, with ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary on one side and a whole range of apparently disparate vocabularies going into the other class as covertly metalinguistic, there is, I think, no trace of in Wittgenstein. The division of expressive roles that I'm claiming for Sellers binds together modal, semantic, intentional, logical, and ontological categorical vocabulary in opposition to empirical descriptive vocabularies, traces back to Kant's idea of pure concepts of the understanding, or categories, which play quite a different expressive role from that of ordinary empirical descriptive concepts. The expressive role of pure concepts is, roughly, to make explicit what's implicit in the use of ground-level concepts, the conditions under which alone it's possible to apply them, which is to say, for Kant, to use them to make judgments. Though very differently conceived, Kant's distinction is in turn rooted in the epistemological difference Hume had noticed and elaborated between ordinary empirical descriptive concepts and concepts expressing lawful causal explanatory connections between them. Hume, of course, drew skeptical conclusions from the observation that claims formulated in terms of the latter sort of concept couldn't be justified by the same sort of means used to justify claims formulated in terms of ordinary empirical descriptive concepts. Kant, however, looks at Newton's formulation of the best empirical understanding of his day and sees that the newly introduced concepts, such as force and mass, are not intelligible apart from the laws that relate them. If we give up the claim that F equals ma, then we do not mean force and mass, but we're using some at least slightly different concepts. This leads Kant to two of his deepest and most characteristic metaconceptual innovations. Thinking of laws formulated using alethic modal concepts as making explicit rules for reasoning with ordinary empirical descriptive concepts, and understanding the contents of those ordinary empirical descriptive concepts as articulated by those rules of reasoning with them. This line of thought starts by revealing the semantic presuppositions of Hume's epistemological arguments. For Hume assumes that the contents of ordinary empirical descriptive concepts are intelligible antecedently to and independently of taking them to stand to one another in rule-governed inferential relations of the sort made explicit by modal concepts. Rejecting that semantic atomism then emerges for Kant as a way of denying the intelligibility of the predicament that Hume professes to find himself in, namely understanding ordinary empirical descriptive concepts perfectly well, but getting no grip thereby on the content of the laws expressed by subjunctively robust rules relating them. Even though Kant took it that Hume's skeptical epistemological argument rests on a semantic mistake, from his point of view, Hume's investigation had uncovered a crucial semantic difference between the expressive roles of different kinds of concepts. Once his attention had been directed to them, Kant set himself the task of explaining what was special about these non-descriptive concepts. Two features of Kant's account of the expressive role distinctive of the special class of concepts to which Hume had directed his attention are of particular importance for the story that I'm telling here. They're categorical concepts and they're pure concepts. To say that they're categorical in this context means that they make explicit aspects of the form of the conceptual as such. For Kant, concepts are functions of judgment. That is, they're to be understood in terms of their role in judging. Categorical concepts express structural features of empirical descriptive judgments. What they make explicit is implicit in the capacity to make judgments at all. That's what I meant when I said that rather than describing how the world is, the expressive job of these concepts is to make explicit necessary features of the framework of discursive practices within which it's possible to describe how things are. The paradigm here is the alethic modal concepts that articulate the subjunctively robust consequential relations among descriptive concepts. It's those relations that make possible explanations of why one description applies because another one does. And now here I'm going to be covering some ground that Dionysius summarized very helpfully. That force necessarily equals the product of mass and acceleration means that one can explain the specific acceleration of a given mass by describing the force that was applied to it. To say that these concepts are pure is to say that they're available to concept users, judgers, those who can understand, since for understanding is the faculty of judgment, is to say that they're available to concept users a priori. Since what they express is implicit in any and every use of concepts to make empirical judgments, there's no particular such concept one must have or judgment one must make in order to be able to deploy the pure concepts of the understanding. To say that judges can grasp these pure concepts a priori is not to say that they're immediate in the Cartesian sense of non-representational. Precisely not. The sort of self-consciousness, awareness of the structural features of the discursive as such that they make possible is mediated by those pure concepts. What was right about the Cartesian idea of the immediacy of self-consciousness is rather that these mediating concepts are available to every thinker a priori. Their grasp does not require the grasp or deployment of any particular ground-level empirical concepts. It's implicit in the grasp or deployment of any such concepts. The way I'll eventually recommend that we think about this distinctive a prioricity is that in being able to deploy ordinary empirical descriptive concepts, one already knows how to do everything one needs to know how to do in order to be able to deploy the concepts that play the expressive role characteristic of the concepts Kant picks out as categorial, in particular, alethic modal concepts. Seller's development of Kant's idea of pure concepts of the understanding is articulated by two master ideas. First, his successor metaconception comprises concepts that are in some broad sense metalinguistic. In pursuing this line, he follows Carnap, who besides ground-level empirical descriptive vocabulary, allowed metalinguistic vocabulary is also legitimate in formal languages regimented so as to be perspicuous. Such metalinguistic vocabulary allows the formulation of explicit rules governing the use of descriptive locutions. Ontologically classifying terms, a little bit of a garden path sentence there. Ontologically classifying terms, such as object, property, and proposition, are for Carnap quasi-syntactical metavocabulary, corresponding to overtly syntactical expressions in a proper meta-language, terms such as singular term, predicate, and declarative sentence. They're used to formulate L rules, which specify the structure of the language in which empirical descriptions are to be expressed. Alethic modal vocabulary is used to formulate Carnap's P rules, which specify rules for reasoning with particular empirically contentful descriptive vocabulary. Carnap's neo-Kantianism does not extend to embracing the metaconcept of categories, which he identifies with the excesses of transcendental idealism. But in the expressions Carnap classifies as overtly or covertly metalinguistic, Sellers sees the raw materials for a more thoroughly Kantian successor conception to the idea of pure categories of the understanding. The second strand, guiding Sellers' reconceptualization of Kantian categories, is his semantic inferentialist approach to understanding the content of descriptive concepts. Sellers picks up on Kant's rejection of the semantic atomism characteristic of both the British empiricism of Locke and Hume that Kant was reacting to, and the 20th century logical empiricism of Carnap that Sellars was reacting to. The way he works out the anti-atomist lesson he learns from Kant is in terms of the essential contribution made to the contents of ordinary empirical descriptive concepts by the inferential connections among them appealed to in explanations of why some descriptions apply to something in terms of other descriptions that apply to it. Here, by now famous passage, although describing, explaining are distinguishable, they're in an important sense inseparable. It's only because the expressions in terms of which we describe objects locate those objects in a space of implications that they describe it all rather than merely label. The descriptive and explanatory resources of language advance hand in hand. So this passage is framed in terms of a distinction between a weaker notion, labeling, and a stronger one, describing. By labeling, Sellars here just means discriminating in the sense of responding differentially. But he wants to distinguish labeling from describing. The idea is that since labeling looks only to the circumstances in which a label is, would be, or should be applied, expressions used with the semantic characteristics of labels address at most one of the fundamental aspects of the characteristic use of descriptions. The rules for the use of labels tell us something about what is, or would be, or should be, in effect so described, but say nothing at all about what it's described as. That, Sellars thinks, depends on the consequences of applying one description rather than another. The semantics of genuine descriptions must look downstream inferentially, as well as upstream to the consequences of application as well as to the circumstances of application. It's this additional inferential feature of their use that distinguishes descriptions from labels. Making a further move, Sellars understands those consequences of application of descriptions as essentially involving inferential connections to other descriptive concepts. This is what he means by saying that what distinguishes descriptions from labels is their situation in a space of implications. Paralleling the discussion of circumstances of application, we can think of those implications, the consequences of application, as specifying what other descriptions do, would, or should follow from the application of the initial, perhaps responsively eliminated description. In the opening sentences of that passage, Sellars includes understanding as one of the phenomena he takes to be intricated with description in the way explaining is. Understanding a descriptive concept requires being able to place it in a space of implications, partly in virtue of which it has the content that it does. This is for Sellars in general a kind of knowing how, rather than a kind of knowing that. It's being able to distinguish in practice the circumstances and consequences of application of the concept, when it's appropriately applied, and what follows from so applying it. In this sense, grasping a concept is not an all or none thing. The ornithologist knows her way around inferentially in the vicinity of terms like icterid and passerine much better than I do. And a consequence of this way of understanding is that one cannot grasp one concept without grasping many. This is Sellars' way of developing Kant's anti-atomist semantic insight. And taking a further step, Sellars also thinks that the inferences articulating the consequences of concepts used descriptively must always include subjunctively robust inferences. That's, of course, just the sort of inferential connection that Hume's empiricist atomist semantics for descriptive concepts, construed in Sellars' terms as labels, could not underwrite. Sellars' conception of descriptions as distinguished from labels is his way of following out what he sees as Kant's anti-atomist semantic insight. And modal concepts are the ones that make explicit those necessary inferential consequential connections between descriptive concepts. So they thereby perform the expressive role characteristic of Kantian categories, expressing essential features of the framework within which alone description is possible. All of this is meant to explicate what Sellars means by saying that the descriptive and explanatory resources of language advance hand in hand. In addition to Kant's original idea of categories, Sellars here takes over Carnap's idea of understanding concepts whose paradigm is modal concepts as in some sense metalinguistic. The principal class of genuinely intelligible, non-defective, non-descriptive vocabulary that Carnap allows in the logical syntax of language is syntactic metavocabulary, and what he there calls quasi-syntactic vocabulary, which is metalinguistic but covertly. It's in the material rather than the formal mode. For Sellers, the rules which modal vocabulary expresses are rules for deploying linguistic locutions. Their rulishness is their subjunctive robustness. Following out this line of thought, Sellers takes it that, in his phrase, grasp of a concept is mastery of the use of a word. And then he understands the metalinguistic features in question in terms of rules of inference, whose paradigms are Carnap's L rules and P rules. His generic term for the inferences that articulate the contents of ordinary empirical descriptive concepts is material inferences. The term is chosen to contrast with inferences that are formal, in the sense of depending on logical form. In Inference and Meaning, he lays out the options he considers. This is on your handout. There's 6 of them. I'm not going to read them. The first of them is material rules are as essential to meaning as formal rules, contributing to the architectural detail of its structure within the flying buttresses of logical form, as Danielle told us. He says a little bit later in that essay, it's the first or rationalistic alternative to which he's committed. According to it, material transformation rules determine the descriptive meaning of the expressions of a language within the framework provided by logical transformation rules. In traditional language, when he says that, he always means Kant, the content of concepts as well as their logical form is determined by the rules of the understanding. But the talk of transformation rules is Carnapian. As I've already indicated, the material inferential rules that in one or another of these senses determine the descriptive meaning of expressions are for Sellers just the subjunctively robust, hence explanation-supporting ones. As he puts the point in the title of a long essay, he construes concepts as involving laws and inconceivable without them. This is his response to Quine's implicit challenge in 2 Dogmas of Empiricism to say what features of their use distinguishes inferences determining conceptual contents from those that simply register matters of fact. Since empirical inquiry is generally required to determine what laws govern concepts such as copper, temperature, or mass, Sellers accepts the consequence that inquiry plays the role not only of determining facts, but also of improving our conceptions, of teaching us more about the concepts that articulate those facts by teaching us more about what really follows from what, in a subjunctively robust counterfactual supporting sense of follows from. On this way of understanding conceptual content, the modal concepts that express the lawfulness of connections among concepts and so underwrite subjunctively robust implications, concepts such as law, necessity, and what's expressed by the subjunctive mood, have a different status from those of ordinary empirical descriptive concepts. Rather than in the first instance describing how the world is, they make explicit features of the framework that makes such description possible. Because they play this distinctive framework explicating role, what they express must be implicitly understood by anyone who can deploy any ground-level descriptive concepts. As I put the point, in knowing how to, being able to, use any ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary, each interlocutor thereby already knows how to do everything she needs to know how to do in order to be able to deploy the modal locutions that register the subjunctive robustness of the inferences that in turn determine the content of the descriptive concepts that vocabulary expresses. This is what Kant's idea that the pure concepts of the understanding are knowable a priori becomes when transposed into Sellers' framework. These 2 lines of thought that orient Sellers' treatment of alethic modality, namely semantic inferentialism and a metalinguistic understanding of the expressive role characteristic of modal locutions, are epitomized in an early formulation. He says, I shall be, and this is from CDCM, I shall be interpreting our rules to the effect that A causally necessitates B as the expression of a rule governing our use of the terms A and B, where the rule in question is understood as a rule licensing subjunctively robust inferences. I've been filling in the claim about this overall approach to modality as a development in Kant's notion of the category, pure concepts of the understanding. Sellers himself, however, never discusses this aspect of his work under the heading of Kantian categories. When he talks about Kantian categories, he turns instead to his nominalism about abstract entities. The central text here is his 1970 paper, Towards a Theory of the Categories. The story he tells there begins with Aristotle's notion of categories as ontological summa genera. There he opposes an unobjectionable hierarchy. Fido is a dachshund, Fido is a dog, Fido is a brute, Fido is an animal. I'm not sure why brute comes between dog and animal. Fido is a corporeal substance, Fido is a substance, with a potentially problematic hierarchy. X is red, X is a color, X is a perceptual quality, X is a quality. The next decisive move in understanding the latter hierarchy he attributes to Occam, whom he reads as transposing the discussion into a metalinguistic key. Occam's strategy, he tells us, is to understand man as a species as dot man is a sortal mental term, while construing mental items as analogous to linguistic expressions in overt speech. This sketch then sets up the transition to what Sellers makes of Kant's understanding of categories. He says, quote, "What all this amounts to is that to apply Occam's strategy to the theory of categories is to construe categories as classifications of conceptual items. This becomes, in Kant's hands, the idea that categories are the most generic functional classifications of elements of judgment." And at the end of this development, from Aristotle through Occam to Kant, he concludes, quote, "Instead of being summa genera of entities, which are objects in the world, categories are summa genera of conceptual items." End of the quote. The account he goes on to expound in this essay, as well as in his other expositions of his nominalism about terms for qualities or properties, construes such terms metalinguistically, as referring to the inferential roles of the base-level concepts as used in empirical descriptions. I explain how I understand this view and the arguments on this topic in the last chapter of From Empiricism to Expressivism on Sellers' metalinguistic expressive nominalism. Without going further into that intricate view here, the point I want to make is that although Sellers does not say so, the metaconceptual role he here explicitly puts forward as a successor concept to Kant's notion of category is generically the same that I've argued he takes alethic modal locutions to play. And it's this capacious conception that I want to build upon and develop further in thinking about what we might make of Kant's notion of categories today. The general conception of pure categorical concepts that I've been attributing to Sellers, based on commonalities visible in his treatment of alethic modal vocabulary and of abstract ontological vocabulary, develops Kant's idea by treating some vocabularies and the concepts they express as covertly metalinguistic. This Sellarsian conception represents his development of Carnap's classification of some expressions as quasi-syntactic. And the underlying insight is that some important kinds of vocabularies that are not strictly or evidently metalinguistic are used not only to describe things, but in ways that at least also depend on the use of other vocabularies, paradigmatically empirical descriptive ones. The lessons I draw from the strengths and weaknesses of Sellers' successor conception to Kant's pure concepts of the understanding are fourfold. That is, I think he's pointing towards an expressive role characteristic of some concepts and the vocabularies expressing them that has four distinctive features. First, these concepts express what I'll call pragmatically mediated semantic relations between vocabularies. Second, those concepts play the expressive role of making explicit essential features of the use of some other vocabulary. Third, the proper use of these concepts can be systematically elaborated from the use of that other vocabulary. And fourth, the features of the vocabulary or concept use that they explicate are universal. They're features of any and every autonomous discursive practice, every language game you could play, though you played no other. I think there are concepts that play this distinctive fourfold expressive role, and that's a good thing to mean today by the term category, is this kind of meta-concept. So stepping back slightly, I want to say that of these two big neo-Kantian ideas that Kant had, the scientific naturalism as a reading of phenomena and noumena, that's one that is abroad in the land today. There's lots of people that think, what we're really talking about, what's really real, is what science is eventually going to tell us. That's the bad idea, I think, though I'm not arguing that here. We'll talk some more about that later. The good idea, the really important, deeply resonant philosophical idea that he has, what he makes of the Kantian notion of the categories, there is nobody else thinking about this other than downstream from Sellers. This was absolutely at the center of his thought. It's what tied together his nominalism, his treatment of modality, this metaconceptual expressivism was his go-to strategy for thinking about normative vocabulary, probabilistic vocabulary, and this has, as far as I can see, essentially vanished without a trace. So this, when I think about Sellers in a new generation, this is the idea that I think, more than any other, is worth developing and making something of. Carnap and Tarski had introduced the expression meta-language for languages that let one talk about languages, with the paradigmatic examples being for Carnap syntactic meta-languages, for Tarski semantic meta-languages. In his earliest writings, Sellers also talks about pragmatic meta-languages, meaning languages for talking about the use of expressions, rather than the syntactic or semantic properties of expressions. And we saw Boris pointing out that Sellers talks about pragmatics as not to be laid alongside semantics and syntax, but as the overarching concept that has syntactic and semantic dimensions. These were to be the languages in which we conduct what in that period he called pure pragmatics. During and after Sellers' most important work in the Anni Mirabiles of 1954 to 63, though, possibly influenced by Carnap, Sellers shifts to using the expression semantics to cover essentially the same ground. I think this was a decisive step backwards, and that it's one of the obstacles that prevented Sellers from getting clear about the sense in which he wanted to claim that locutions such as a lethic modal vocabulary and singular terms purporting to refer to universals, like circularity, and their kinds, property, are covertly metalinguistic. One vocabulary serving as a pragmatic metavocabulary for another is the most basic kind of pragmatically mediated semantic relation between vocabularies. A pragmatic metavocabulary is one that lets you say what you have to do to be using expressions in another vocabulary. And if we look at Sellers' account of semantic vocabulary, of something like means, what he's really telling us, I think, is that when you say wrote means read, what you're doing is functionally classifying the expression wrote as a read. That dot quoting is letting us say what you're doing when you use the semantic vocabulary. Similarly, when we say circularity is a property, he follows Carnap in saying, well, what you're doing when you say that is classifying circular as a one-place predicate. He should have thought of what he was doing in terms of pragmatic metalanguages. Now, the first pretty picture on your handout is a diagram of the relation of being a pragmatic metavocabulary for. V prime is a pragmatic metavocabulary. It lets you say what the practices P are, in virtue of which you're using another vocabulary. The diagram means that the vocabulary V prime is VP sufficient, vocabulary practice sufficient for specifying the practices P, which are PV sufficient, practice vocabulary sufficient. If you engage in those practices, then you are deploying that vocabulary with the meanings. And the relation between the two vocabularies the dotted line, that's the relation of being a pragmatic metavocabulary. Sellers tied himself into knots, trying to, in CDCM, trying to specify the relation between the rules of inference that he thought were expressed by modal vocabulary. He said, well, you're not saying that an inference is good, but you're conveying that information. And I'm saying what he was looking for was the notion of a pragmatic metavocabulary, a vocabulary that lets you say what you're doing in using that vocabulary rather than what you're saying. But he was never able to get clear on this. Yeah, I don't know whether I need to go through the rest of this stuff. I mean, I have a little summary here of what those of you who've seen Between Saying and Doing will recognize as a description of a complex, pragmatically mediated semantic relation. So it's a relation between vocabularies, a semantic relation between vocabularies that is mediated by the fact that one of the vocabularies lets you say what you need to do to use another vocabulary. And it can also be that in this second picture that the pragmatically mediated vocabulary also, it can on the one hand be elaborated from the practices that you use to use the vocabulary for which it's a pragmatic metavocabulary, and it plays the function of making explicit what's in them. So a paradigm is a conditional on Sellers' account. In order to use descriptive vocabulary, you have to, in practice, master the distinguish between some materially good and materially bad inferences. If you can do that, we can introduce if-then, saying the circumstances of application of P arrow Q is you should assert that whenever being committed to P would commit you to Q, and the consequences of application, if you're committed to if P then Q, then you're committed to inferring Q if you're committed to P. That's elaborate. The capacity to use conditionals like that is elaborated from the abilities you've already got to have to distinguish, however fallibly, materially good from materially bad inferences. But once you've got it, it lets you make explicit that commitment to the inferential consequence, which, according to Sellers' semantic inferentialism, is semantogenic. It's the source of the conceptual content. I think that there's that in these terms there's a notion of a distinctive expressive role that concepts can play, that modal vocabulary plays, that ontological categorical vocabulary plays, that logical vocabulary plays, that normative vocabulary plays. All the notions that Sellers gave this covert metalinguistic functional analysis of, that is a worthy successor of Kant's notion of categories. So this is the line of thought that I think is Sellers with a white hat. This is what we can really learn from him. And in other parts of the book, I argue against sort of Sellers with his black hat on, the much more popular naturalistic reductionism. We're going to talk about that in the Author Meets Critics session, because Bill and Jim sort of focus on that side of thing. So the overall theme of the book is there's this fabulous idea that basically vanished, and then there's this not so good idea he had, which is the one that, not particularly from him, but is still popular and is with us. So that's the division, rather than the 41ers and the 36ers, or the left-wing and right-wing Salarzians that I'm suggesting provide the terms we should think about his corpus in. Thank you.
right, so we have a good amount of time for questions here. Who would like to start?
I just want to get clear on one of your remarks about 36. When you sort of said a few words after reading it, the implication seemed to be that you read the principal emphasis there on we are not giving an empirical description of that episode or state, as if he was denying that it was a description. But it seems to me that what he's really denying is that it's an empirical description, because in fact he does exactly what a description is supposed to do, right? He says we're placing in a logical space of reason, and as you also quote from CDC M108, what does it do? What do you have to do in order to describe? You have to locate it in a logical space of implications. So you seem to emphasize the denial of descriptive, but it's really, isn't it the denial of the empirical?
I mean, I think it's both. The being located in a space of implications is necessary for being a description rather than a label, but not sufficient. I mean, anything that's conceptually contentful is going to be in a space of implications. You know, modal vocabulary is going to be, normative vocabulary is going to be. So the mere fact that there's implications that follow from applying it, that's not enough to make it. That's not enough to make it descriptive. But he certainly does think it's not an empirical description, because it's what you're doing is placing it in a normative space. And though every description is in a normative space, giving the description is not yet doing that.
Thank you again for the talk. I want to pick up on a small point that comes up in what you just read to us today, but also in a couple of other papers that are also included in the book, and I think it comes up also in Between Saying and Doing. So though it's a small point, it seems to come up very often. I wanted to press you on it. It's the assimilation of the kind of worries that Hume articulated about modal vocabulary to Quine, right? So it's the assimilation of Hume to Quine you seem to suggest that there's a commonality between them, and it's true that they were both skeptical about modality to some extent, but I guess I think the skepticism was rooted in very, very, very different concerns, and that the difference matters in this context in the sense that if we draw the Salarzian lesson that you're inviting us to draw, Hume turns out to be dead wrong, but Quine's skepticism still remains. And here's what I mean. So Hume really didn't seem to be able to conceive of himself. He seemed to be able to conceive of himself as being in the situation of understanding ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary, but just not being able to understand modal vocabulary. But Quine's concern about modality isn't that. Quine is concerned about quantifying in. Quine is concerned about how something can have something can have de re necessary properties, you could put it that way, or how one thing. Yeah. Anyway, I'll leave it there. It seems like Quine's concerns were more technical and Hume's were less so.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think Quine's concerns are just the transposition into his setting of the Humean concerns, because it wasn't just quantifying in or de re propositional attitude ascriptions. It was anything that was non-extensional. He could understand, he thought, extensional properties, where it was just a matter of what the extension is as settled by, as we would put it, not his way of doing it, the possible world we're actually in. What he didn't understand was properties that depend on something that isn't true, some mere possibility, anything that was non-extensional. So it's not just modal vocabulary, but doubting the intelligibility as they stand of propositional attitude ascriptions, because they're intentional too, needing to reduce. So his strategy is to reduce that to a disquotational, metalinguistic thing that he can be extensional about. Didn't work very well, but his concern really was about the intelligibility of any properties construed as non-extensional. coming out of Tarski, he thinks he understands objects and domains of objects to begin with, and as long as there's nothing more to a property than the set of objects that it's true of, he understands properties. But if there's anything more robust than that, he doesn't understand it. And that, yes, it's transposed into this technical issue of extensional or intentional, but it's the same thing. He doesn't understand intentional properties, anything that depends on anything other than the actual set of facts. So that's where I see the sort of semantic commonality. And there was a sort of common empiricist epistemology that I think in each case connived at that semantic blind spot for them.
Can I have a follow-up if nobody else? Just as a quick follow-up, that's actually super helpful, and I'm going to have to give that more thought. But I guess I want to ask a related question, which is you've argued here that in order to understand descriptive predicates specifically, we're going to need to be able to draw subjunctively. We're going to be able to use subjunctives with respect to those predicates. I wonder if you would say the same about singular terms, which really are the domain where Quine's quantifying in concerns come in. Is it that in order to understand Robert Brandom, I need to be able to understand very subjunctive things that would be true and wouldn't be true?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Because it's got to fall under some kind of sortal for you to have criteria of identity and individuation for the object. And those sortals are predicates, but in addition to having circumstances and consequences of application, like predicates like read, they also come with criteria of identity and individuation, which are precisely subjunctively robust. They're saying when person A and person B would be the same person, or when you should count them as two persons, or when you should count them as one. And one of the principal arguments that Dionysius was looking at was the claim that once you give up the idea that extensional properties are so much as intelligible, that the idea that there are no empirical descriptive properties that are modally insulated, whose proper applicability doesn't have as necessary conditions what would happen if. And so when you give up that idea, then you see that two individuals that fall under different sortals can't really be identical. There are special cases where they can. Phase sortals, for instance, where the criteria of identity and individuation of kitten and of cat are the same, and only the circumstances of application are different. But for instance, no extended physical object is identical to the mereological sum of any set of particles, because the criteria of identity and individuation of mereological sums is so different from that of anything else. So Quine again thought that he could make sense of the notion of object, no sortal, so no criteria of identification, because he specified his domains in an expressively much more powerful meta language that he didn't worry about where that came from. And it was parasitic on the expressive resources, that more powerful meta language, that he could get his domain on the basis of which he could then build up this, I want to say, fantasy of extensional properties. I mean, it's not a fantasy in philosophical semantics, in formal semantics, but in philosophical semantics, it's a fantasy.
I guess I wonder what result that conception gives in the Quine's example, the famous example of the planets and the numbers. So it seems like it would wind up that the number of planets really isn't 9, because it is true of 9 that it's greater than 7, but it's not true of the number of planets that it's necessarily greater than 7. So it seems like if you take properties like being necessarily greater than 7 as one of the sortals that's helping us individuate a particular thing, then it turns out that 9 is not the number of planets. How does that work?
I mean, we need a much fancier story than I've so much as waved my hands at here. And in the relevant chapter in From Empiricism to Expressivism, I do it, but those properties aren't sortal properties, and we need to look at the ones that identify and individuate, and in each case we're talking about numbers, those line up. So I mean, indeed, you do need to draw a line where not every intentional property, not being thought by me identical to the person I met yesterday, for instance, that isn't something that we're going to take as a licit property for applying Leibniz's law.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Thank you.
But hardly any identities are true.
Thank you, Professor Brandom. I really, really loved reading your book, got a lot out of it. I want to try to ask a question that I tried to ask when I first met you at the beginning of the conference here. And it's about the kind of laws that are necessary for having contentful, empirical, descriptive concepts. Because I think everything you said is absolutely correct, and I'm wondering, however, though, even that whether the sort of things that you've said are, if we have necessary and sufficient conditions for possession of certain empirical descriptive concepts. And I'll use an example from your book, a couple of the laws of, in this case, it's material incompatibilities. You give examples of things like knowing no monochromatic patch can be both red and green, or knowing that it is impossible for a square plane figure to be circular. While I think that would be absolutely sufficient for having such concepts, necessary, I wonder if it's sufficient. And where I would think that this might need to go, because my worry is I might be able to know things like that merely in an a priori way. If I know that certain properties, say, are determinants of the same determinable, then I might just know a priori then, because they're different determinants of the same determinable, that if it's one, it's not the other. But, and I think Sellers has this kind of a worry in that article, Concepts as Involving Laws and Inconceivable Without Them. He's looking for these things he's calling material invariancies, right? So I'm wondering if a little bit more is required to actually really have contentful empirical descriptive concepts, and what you might have to say about that. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not true that different determinants under a determinable are always incompatible with one another. I mean, we can look at the determinants under the category of building in terms of their shape and in terms of their color, and something could, have both of those. The family of colors and of shapes are quite special cases in that regard. I mean, in a way, it's misleading for me to talk about concept possession in connection with Sellers, because he's a Kantian, and the one of Kant's innovations is to shift our attention from thinking about our grip on concepts, sort of, is it clear, is it distinct, to thinking about their grip on us. Have I bound myself by this rule, by this rule of inference? So when Sellers says grasp of a concept is mastery of the use of a word, I think he's thinking of the concept itself as articulated by this constellation of material consequence and incompatibility relations, which is reflected in the norms that are administered by sort of experts in the community. Now, what are the minimum conditions under which I can apply, say, the concept molybdenum, where I know very little about what the good inferences and what the incompatibilities are of it? And there seem to be actually, nothing of very general interest to say about that question. I mean, I basically count as having molybdenum thoughts and not ytterbium thoughts, even though I guess I don't know anything that's true of one of them and not true of the other, because I'm generally a competent English speaker, and so count as having played the molybdenum card. When I say molybdenum, then I've committed myself, and now the metallurgist can come and say, so you're committed to it being more dense than copper. Well, yeah, I am, because I played that counter in the game, and I don't need to know that that was the effect of the move that I made. And similarly, sort of in thought. So,
Surely somebody would have to know, though, right?
well, we're always on our way to more adequate concepts. That's why I was, the norms that are actually in play as administered by the experts may not fully track, generally don't fully track what really follows from what and what's really incompatible with what. That's why the development of the concepts, we're sort of always on our way to better ones. And there's a sense in which we can assess each other as using already the eventual ones in terms of what we're, there is a sense of committed, under which I'm committed to whatever really follows from it, even if none of us know that. But we got to keep separate books on that from what am I committed to as far as what am I blameworthy for, not acknowledging in the community.
Bob, this is just a very small thing which follows on from the question about whether this is applicable to singular terms. What struck me was that once you recognize that it is, it begins to look difficult to really come up with a notion of label to which it doesn't apply. And if you think of actual labeling practices, for one thing, they're kind of diachronic, both on the side of typically on the side of the object labeled, and on the side of the language user, in the sense that we want to be able to, as it were, come back to the fact that something is labeled on separate occasions. And on both sides there are going to be considerations about, as it were, whether the circumstances under which it's a proper labeling still apply. You think of a sticky label put on your bag when you check in your luggage. In unusual circumstances, that sticky label can get on somebody else's bag. So it looks like even ordinary labeling practices have lots of these sort of material expectations built into them.
Yeah, I think that's right. And Wilfred made fun of as a foil the Fido semantic picture. We just stick this word onto this dog. But as you're saying, just so much as to be able to track Fido requires so much more stage setting and other conceptual capacities than the people who have the Fido picture,
Exactly.
say Jerry Fido Fodor,
Yes.
who has such a picture and is not putting all of that conceptual stage setting in the picture. So I think there is a sort of straw man notion of labeling that he's using. It's sort of labeling the way people are thinking about labels. And I would just point out in passing that I refuse to wear these name labels that we have for the conference, because having wrestled for so long with label theories of naming and of describing, I no longer subscribe to label theories of labels and just think we'd be better off if we didn't use labels and it's just sentences, please. But yes, I think it definitely is a much fancier conceptual achievement than the sort of straw man picture of it. But anyway, describing ain't that straw man picture.
Do we have time for maybe one more brief question? Brief maybe scared everyone? All right, well, in that case, we will take a break for about 15 minutes until 4:30. Oh, is that a hand? Is that a question there? Oh, sorry. We'll take a break until 4:30, and then we will pick up with the Author Meets Critics session. Thank you very much.